Now, as I mentioned, I'm giving credit to Kant for really kind of rolling with this idea of embodied capital. But there are a lot of others who are talking about embodiment and embodied capital within sociology now. And I believe in our department there's even a course called Sociology of the Body, which I'm by no means an expert in, but this is certainly a part of what we're talking about, of how this culture is a part of the reproduction of inequality. I want to just highlight a couple of sources for thinking about the body that Kant is drawing on and that you're familiar with. We've actually talked about Mauss before, Marcel Mauss, M-A-U-S-S. This was Emile Durkheim's nephew, actually. And then, of course, we've talked a lot about Bourdieu, but I want to say a couple things about their ideas of bodies. Mauss, in his work, had these kind of terrific cross-cultural, or what we would now call cross-national or cross-society comparisons about the way bodies worked. And he saw this as strong evidence, and I think he was right, about the way society shapes bodies and body interaction in a way that is often disguised to us, unless often we step into a society that does these things quite differently. And we often experience as difference and maybe the incorrect way of doing something, but those are all signals of having stepped into a social order that operates very differently vis-a-vis the body. But Mauss had this kind of collection of observations in various writings about bodies, and some of the things he pointed out that vary and hence help us to see that what is done with bodies is created. Some of the characteristics of variance that he saw were these. For example, he noted that the size of personal space could vary quite a bit socially and could vary over time within a given society. So we have kind of a cutesy way of talking about it in our society, this idea of personal space. But that's actually kind of a common sense way of talking about real variation and differentiation between kind of congealed group space, so how we interact when we're a part of a group, versus kind of the space that exists when we interact maybe one-on-one or in small groups. And Mauss pointed out, and anthropologists have made quite clear too, that what is allowed in space in terms of interacting between bodies can be quite divergent. So for example, give an example from my own life. When I lived in Guatemala for a number of months, I lived in Washington, D.C. and was quite used to riding the public bus system. And in Washington, D.C., in the public bus system, as you waited at the curb, maybe 4 people who you didn't know waiting to get on a bus to take you across town, you don't get too close, right? If somebody's getting close to you, that raised suspicion. They're trying to reach into a pocket. Are they trying to hit on me? Is there something wrong with them that they would not know to stand further away from me? And you became clued into that right quickly, right? So if you were standing, you might give yourself at least a good foot, if not more, in the from the person in front of you. And then everybody else coming up to get on the bus knew that space that you've left was personal space, and they couldn't just step into. Well, when I lived in Guatemala for three months, I was introduced to a very different, some people would say culture, but we know that more specifically a very different system of queuing, of lining up. And actually there's been some really interesting sociology articles written about different kind of systems of lining up, not based on some just value driving people differently, but based on different conceptions of bodies and different conceptions of space and how close you can get. So when I lined up for a bus in Guatemala, it was much more intense. There was lots of like banging and kind of pushing for space. If I had left that 12 inches of space that I was used to in Washington, D.C., there would very easily be somebody that would kind of step right in. That's empty space. That's a space that could be filled with by a body, and they could be right there. And there wasn't this sense of kind of perfectly graduated lining up in a certain order. Instead, it could be kind of a mass of people kind of converging, trying to squeeze into a door in the bus. totally different way of working with bodies in space. Much more closeness and without kind of formal distinctions where one body began and one body ended. And there's all sorts of observations, other observations we can make about space. For example, over time in our country, how genders share space, or I'm sorry, different sexes share space or operate in space has changed quite drastically. All you have to do is watch an episode of Mad Men to see that certain sexes were allowed into certain spaces and others were not. Actually, all you have to do is turn into the Masters tournament next weekend to see how golf and this private club holding on to a certain pattern of sex relations that is decades old and in most spaces has been overturned still exists. Women can still not be members of the Augusta National Club that sponsors the Masters. And we look at that now as kind of a odd, unfair, maybe unjust, distasteful set of relations by this club, which they're legally allowed to do because they're private. But it highlights to us that even in our own country over time, body relations have changed over time. So that's Mauss helping us to see kind of cross society these really different ways that bodies are used. Bourdieu, he looked at bodies, but he never developed really this concept of embodied capital like Kahn did. But what he saw was that bodies over time become formed by the demands of their material environment. Now that should ring a bell about the habitus and generally, that the habitus is informed by the interactions and practical demands of its environment. But with the body, those demands and formation of the environment become visible, right? And what Bourdieu was interested in is how he would look at how certain occupations in different class positions over time would form a body to be a certain way. So if you're a laborer, over time you might develop lots of muscle mass, but you might also get arthritic or gnarled hands, and you might have back injuries that kind of have you bent over. Whereas if you were an academic like me, you might be not have much skin color in terms of sun because you spend it in time all day. You might have very much softer hands. I can even compare to people I went to high school with that ended up being farmers. They have much more kind of coarse hands. And what Bourdieu was interested in is that these differences could become naturalized to the point of where people might say like, oh yeah, that person was meant to be a farmer, or yeah, that guy, he was meant to be a scholar, as if somehow my body predisposed a certain path. But what Bourdieu helps us understand is that the formation that we see is really a formation with a deep history. The body we see now has a deep history before it, and that bodies, when born, could go in many different trajectories. But like the habitus, the body, which is intimately connected with the habitus, is shaped over time and to look seemingly naturally connected, just as the habitus feels naturally connected with the environment that it's shaped in. So those are just kind of a couple background sources that Kahn is drawing on in his comments about embodied capital. So let me just make some more general or more specific points actually about embodied capital and bodies to help you understand this reading. First is that bodies, of course, are, let me get a little bit better pen here, are natural or biological, but quickly lots of wow, I'm spelling poorly today, biological, but quickly lots of natural or biological things become to be socially patterned. So let me give you an example. A lot of body movement that is natural could include things like yawns, for example, like that, or maybe drinking. I mean, you do have to learn how to use a cup, but you could say at some level we're humans, we're an organism that needs water. This is our way to get the water, so there's some sort of basic, natural, biological way to get water. But quickly, these things become patterns. So if I do this, You might say, wow, that's kind of rude of Professor Adler just to yawn without covering his mouth. A socially patterned way of yawning that seems natural but actually is a learned behavior. Or, as I sometimes do with my coffee in the lectures, I drink, but if I drink like this, you have a very different reaction to what is still, maybe at some root, a natural biological behavior, but has become quite socially patterned. So bodies, and what we do with our bodies, is we display this kind of, again, in Pierre Bourdieu's sense, pragmatic knowledge that we've accrued over these interactions in our past. And what we do with our bodies, yawn, drink, we usually are not thinking about. It's a separate system within our system of cognition. So it doesn't require deep, constant thinking to do the yawn or to do the drinking, but those things are still patterned in ways that aren't simply about nature or biology. And really importantly, and this becomes clear in Kahn, certain aspects of bodies, so for example, gender, race, as both become very clear in the Kahn chapters, become quite patterned. Both of these actually start to be shaped very early on. So what can be seen as just biological or natural, or what we may experience of that, unless we are kind of able to reveal in our own mind how these systems work socially, they are seen as natural. And as I've said, they are shaped quite early on. So gender, we know, gender, the shaping of gender and how little girls and little boys should move their bodies or what they do with their bodies happens very early on. From parenting styles, from gifts, from toys, to roles that children are taught in school. For example, another example is with race. We've mentioned this Trayvon Martin case before, and it's very clear that subcultures in the United States, racial subcultures, are oftentimes marked because they have an overt biological visible difference, and differences or judgments, social differences or judgments, get mapped onto those biological characteristics and somehow reveal inherent character. So that a hurdle for many racial groups in the United States is somehow to try and display a non-racial body. So somehow to overcome or make disappear this difference, which has actually really been mapped on by other racial groups. So for example, the Trayvon Martin case in the hoodie has become quite symbolically important. And the hoodie is loaded, possibly for the person that killed him, as supposedly displaying something inherent or problematic about this certain person. But a hoodie, of course, disconnected from those social conceptions, is lethal or violent in no way at all. So part of what we're doing here is trying to pull apart these interrelations between the maybe some base natural biological elements and elements that get built on top of that through interactions. And all of this, or a lot of this, what happens with bodies or what people are taught to do with their bodies is often, remember, non-cognitive, pre-reflexive. So it's over time developed pragmatically in people and then begins to be seen by others as naturalized. Let me pause right here and I'll be right back.